Welcome back, guys. We are into our third video on the First World War, which is our Unit 5. And in this video, we're going to focus on a couple of the major battles. Now, a war that takes place over multiple continents and goes on for 4 years and involves many countries. There are so many battles we could talk about that we could literally spend the rest of the school year just going over battles from World War I. We're not going to do that, though, of course. We're going to focus on just a few of the most famous battles and talk about why they happened and what effect they had on the war. So we're going to begin by actually going outside of Europe for a moment. Okay, so let's go back and kind of get a feel for what countries are where. Remember, the Central Powers were Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and Ottoman Empire. And then everybody in purple is part of the so-called Allies. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go to the Middle East as we begin our look at major battles. So as we're looking at the Middle East, which is, basically this area, you can see the dominant country there was the Ottoman Empire, which, if you remember from World War I, they are an ally of Germany, and they're an opponent of Britain and France. Now, the dominant ethnic group, if you recall, in the Middle East are a group called the Arabs. Right? So Arab people live all basically right through, well, kind of more like right through here. But the Ottoman Empire was ruled not by Arabs, but by Turks. Okay, so this is where nationalism is going to come in and how the British are going to exploit that nationalism to weaken the Ottoman Empire. So the British, they came to the realization that, hey, we could weaken the Ottoman Empire by encouraging Arabs in the Middle East to revolt against the Ottoman Empire because, again, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by Turks, not Arabs. So in theory, Arab nationalists would want to fight for independence. So the British are encouraging this and, in fact, helping them fight back in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. A famous example of this would be a British officer named T.E. Lawrence. T.E. Lawrence had spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and he was well versed on the local culture and history and all that. And he's going to be sent behind enemy lines to assist these Arab rebels against the Turks in leading a guerrilla war. So they're going to, blow up Ottoman rail lines and ambush Ottoman soldiers and that kind of stuff. And you can see revolts are going to take place across modern-day countries of Iraq and Syria and Israel and Lebanon, areas like that. There is T.E. Lawrence. He's better remembered in history as Lawrence of Arabia. So Lawrence of Arabia was under the assumption that when these Arab people rose up in rebellion against the Ottoman Empire, that once the war is over, they would gain their independence. It's kind of like a reward for helping the British. But that's not actually going to happen. As we're going to find out, and we'll talk more about this later at the end of the unit, what's going to happen is the Middle East is actually going to be carved into sort of like, not exactly colonies, but kind of like colonies. They were called mandates, where the French would oversee this area, the British would oversee this area, and this area over here. And so independence would be delayed for those people in this area. All right, so that's enough for the Middle East. Now let's go back to Europe and look at the Western Front. Because remember, the Western Front is the main sort of theater of this war. And we're going to look at two famous bloody battles. One's called Verdun, and the other one is known as the Battle of the Somme. So let's get into the details here. If you recall, Germany, their war effort here, especially early in the war anyways, was centered on capturing the city of Paris, right? The theory was if you took Paris, it would force France out of the war. Now, think about the breakdown of soldiers here. Who has more soldiers, more people they can call on, Germany or France? And the answer is Germany. So Germany comes to the conclusion that maybe we're not going to win this war through some sort of lightning strike, kind of like the Schlieffen Plan. Maybe we can win instead in what we know as a battle of attrition. They're going to choose a particular place on the map to attack. They're going to choose to attack the French right here at a place called Verdun. And the reason they chose there is there were a lot of roads leading from Verdun directly into Paris. So if the Germans were able to capture Verdun, they could once again threaten Paris. That means the French will send in reinforcement after reinforcement to defend Verdun, and the Germans are counting on that. Okay? Why are they counting on that? It's because this was Germany's plan to, again, win that war of attrition by basically throwing lots and lots of German soldiers at the French. Now, the Germans knew they were going to lose a lot of soldiers in this attack. They knew that, but they knew they had more soldiers to lose than the French. So this was an attempt to basically engage the French in battle, grind them down, bleed them to death in a massive battle. Again, the Germans, they know they're going to suffer massive losses, but they can afford these losses more than the French, was the theory. All right, so the Germans are going to open this battle with a massive artillery bombardment. Something like 1 million shells are fired at the at the French. So imagine being a French soldier under bombardment like this. It would have been incredibly scary. It's incredibly intense. Here's a quick view of the French uniforms and how they changed throughout the war. Notice how early in the war they were certainly not designed for any type of camouflage or even really usability. It was more just for kind of looks, right? Red pants, I mean, that's not good. You're going to stand out like a sore thumb for sure. Now, not to say blue, of course, is camouflage, but at least the colors get a little bit more drab as the war goes on. And also, they develop a helmet to help protect against some of that artillery. So you can see here French soldiers here cowering, which I don't blame them, I would be too, against German artillery shells exploding, and that helmet will hopefully protect their head from concussion, from debris, and maybe even shell fragments. All right, I want to show you just how destructive World War I artillery was. So we're looking at a French fort that's near the Verdun battlefield. So in other words, this is a fort that the Germans have to be able to take. So it's kind of a pentagon-shaped fort, you can see. This is before the battle. This is what's left of the fort after the battle. Okay, it's hardly even recognizable. Okay, before the battle, after the battle. Look at what mass artillery can do. It just completely chews up the ground. In fact, it almost looks like something from the moon in this picture. Here's a modern-day view of that same fortification, and you can see even after 100 years later, right, over 100 years later, the craters are still there. Now, the forest has regrown through here, but they've kept it from regrowing here just so they can, keep this area preserved. It's hard to tell. There was a battle right around it, but you can definitely tell there was a battle right here. Other places in Verdun is the same story. You can see craters and chewed up landscape. Again, even a century after the battle, the land still shows the scars. Here you can actually see an old trench line that's eroding away, but this is where soldiers were fighting near the Battle of Verdun. All right, so what's the end result? Does the German plan work? Do they, in fact, bleed the French into surrendering? Well, it turns out, no, they didn't. The French did send in lots of soldiers like the Germans were expecting, and the French did take incredible casualties, but this becomes really a battle of survival for the French nation, and so the French put in maximum effort to defend the Battle of Verdun, and as a result, what little ground the Germans gained, they're pushed back. And so neither side actually gains really much of anything in terms of on the ground, but about 300,000 soldiers died, all told, in this battle. Okay, 300,000 men died, and the front lines didn't really change. This shows you just how difficult it is to break through in World War I, how costly it is to attack the enemy. Here's a famous photograph from World War I. Reportedly, it was taken by a German photographer, and he's kind of looking across no man's land as the French launch a counterattack against the Germans. I don't know if this is authentic or not, but it certainly captures the struggles of World War I pretty well. Now, French losses, as I said, were staggering, but they held on. And this is a cemetery where you can see some of the dead from the Battle of Verdun. laid out in these nice, neat rows with crosses. Now, in a battle that's as destructive as World War I, frankly, and I don't mean to get too gory, but frankly, some of the bodies that were recovered were unidentifiable. Okay, you would just find pieces of soldiers, and you weren't even sure sometimes if it was German or French. And so in this building right here, you've got mass remains of soldiers from the Battle of Verdun who will never be identified, but we just know they died at Verdun. So Verdun, again, this massive German attack where they're trying to break through, trying to break the will of the French. If you're the British Allies up here in Belgium, what could you do to help your buddies out down at Verdun? And what the British decide to do is launch their own massive attack on the Germans. It's called the Battle of the Somme. It takes place up here. So again, the Battle of Verdun's down here. This is where the Battle of the Somme is going to take place. This battle has two goals in it. So the first goal was to help relieve pressure on the French down at Verdun. Okay? In other words, if you attack the Germans, that'll siphon off some German soldiers from their attack on France. It'll weaken that attack on France. Secondly, the British think that perhaps if we just hit the Germans hard enough with enough artillery that we can break through German lines, and then the stalemate of trench warfare will also break down, and finally we'll go back to a war of movement where armies are actually moving and won't be as brutal any longer. And so preceding this attack, the British unload with probably the greatest artillery bombardment of all history. For 5 days, they bombarded German positions, lobbing something like almost 2 million artillery shells on the Germans. In fact, they hit the Germans so hard and so thoroughly with artillery that they were told that once the attack was launched, that there would be pretty much nothing left of the Germans. They would be so destroyed, and even those who survived would be so concussed from battle that basically the British could just walk across no man's land and calmly take over the German trenches. It would be that easy. Of course, nothing is easy in war. Turns out the Germans weren't destroyed by this artillery bombardment. They were down in their bunkers, waiting it out. And once the British guns fall silent and it's clear the British are attacking through no man's land, the Germans run up here and begin to defend their trenches. And on the first day of the Somme, the British suffer incredible losses. Okay, 57,470 casualties. That means killed and wounded. Killed alone, 19,240. This is by far the bloodiest day in all of British history. Okay, I want you to stop and think about that. 19,240 British soldiers killed, not in just this battle, but just on the first day of the battle. Those are losses that are pretty much unimaginable in the modern sense. Unimaginable. Here are the scars on the land. You can see the craters. Again, this is a century later. You can still see the craters. You can still see the trench lines. They're visible here from the sky. Talk about craters. Check this one out. So what this was, it was also part of the Battle of the Somme. It was an attempt to breach the German lines by tunneling under no man's land and planting explosives under the German lines that would be then detonated and allow them to tear a hole in the German defenses. And this was a big one. Check out the size of that crater. Turns out this actually wasn't all that effective, though. There was a delay in sending the British through the lines, and ultimately the Germans are able to recover and defend this territory. So despite the impressive size of this crater, it didn't help the British win the battle. So what are the results of the Battle of the Somme? Do the British break through? Do they help relieve pressure on the French? Well, they do help relieve pressure on the French. That is successful, but they don't break through. Okay, the Allies do gain a little bit of land, about 5 miles worth, but that 5 miles comes at just a terrible cost. Okay, if you put both sides, Allies and Central Powers, together, and you're talking dead and wounded, in this one battle, 1 million people were killed or wounded. 1 million. I mean, that is again, you can't even really wrap your mind around those numbers. They're so staggering. All right, so in this video, guys, we covered some of the major battles. We went to the Middle East. We learned that the Ottoman Empire was weakened by British-inspired rebellions from Arab soldiers and Arab guerrillas in the Middle East. Then we looked at the Battle of Verdun, which was Germany's attempt to bleed the French to death. They were unsuccessful. And then we looked at the Battle of the Somme, which was Britain's attempt to break through German lines. They were also unsuccessful. And the big takeaway from this is these battles just don't do much other than take lots of lives. Neither side is really making any actual progress in this war. They're just killing each other in mass amounts.